I've had the privilege of hosting the entire board of British Petroleum for dinner at home. Yesterday, I had the privilege of participating in ExxonMobil's release of their global outlook for 2050, and I'm very pleased to join the prestigious FT for this session on energy transition. I think India is a good place at this point of time to have a discussion on energy transition for a variety of reasons. One, that our demand and consumption for energy is, I think, about 3 times the global average. We are demonstrating a transition to green energy on various fronts, and I should come back to them in a minute. If you believe in what the global think tanks and forecasters say, 25% of the increase in demand in global energy in the next 2 decades will come from India. And I was pleased that ExxonMobil's global outlook, and indeed that of other similarly placed entities, shows that that transition which is being made clearly shows that India is well positioned. It is currently achieving reasonably impressive rates of transition and is expected to do so in the coming time. First, let me place my overall, do some context setting, if I may use that word. We are a large population. We have our energy demand. When I was associated with the Petroleum and Natural Gas Ministry 3 years ago, we were consuming 5 million barrels of crude oil in a day. That rate has gone up to 5.4 million barrels. And even if the assessments that we are hearing are broadly in place, we will be consuming 6 million plus barrels a day of crude oil in the foreseeable future. We have a refining capacity currently of 252 million metric tons per annum. We already have projects in place to increase that refining capacity to about 300, and the debate on within the government and all the other constituents of the ecosystem is whether we take that refining capacity to 400 or 450 million metric tons per annum. The cynics amongst us might ask, if you're moving away from fossil fuels, why do you need so much refining capacity? Simple answer to that is petchem. Our consumption of petchem is woefully inadequate. If you were to compare India's and China's figures, or India and any other country, we are 1/6, I think, if my researchers will correct me, 1/6 of what should be the global average of consumption. So we require petchems for that. How do I see the transition getting intensified? I will, as I said, take a minute or two on 2 areas where we have reason to be satisfied. When Mr. Modi assumed responsibility 10 years ago, our economy was about $1.9 trillion. Today, it's a $4 trillion economy, and whether you believe the assessments of the IMF and the others, we're headed to be the world's 3rd largest economy by 2027. We are the 5th largest today. And most of the assessments, whether you go by one figure or another, by between 27 and 2030, it's reasonably safe to assume that will be the size of the economy and hence the requirement of energy. I mean, I'm not even bothering to repeat the obvious that energy is the lifeline. And today, if I look around the world and want to study the state of or the health of economies, you just have to look at their energy consumption if you have reliable figures, and you get a reasonably good idea whether they're sticking or, there's cause for concern. Mr. Modi assumed responsibility in 2014. I had something to do with biofuels before that, both as Secretary for Economic Relations in the Foreign Office and earlier as Ambassador to Brazil. The then government had set a target for itself to have 5% blending in 10 of our states and union territories, just 5%. And the results are clear. The overall blending rate when Mr. Modi assumed office, and these figures are based on what the state governments tell us, and being an old world bureaucrat, I always put a slight discounter of 1 or 2% there, because the states will always want to, make their figures look good, but they're small amounts. So they said about 1.6%. I said, no, I take the figure at 1.5%. So with all these efforts that we made for biofuels, largely sugar-based ethanol, we didn't cross 1.5% of overall blending. The Prime Minister set a target of 10% blending by 2022. We were able to achieve that 5 months in advance. He set a target of 20% blending by 2030. We are going to complete that by the end of the ethanol blending year, October 2025. That's 5 years in advance. We saved 91,000 crores on fossil fuel imports because of our ethanol blending. That roughly translates, I think, to $20 billion or so. Why did we set our eyes on 20% blending? For the simple reason that the entrenched interests, and I don't mind saying that openly, many people said, no, you can't blend beyond a point, and the parts in a car need to be changed, this, that, and the other. We did our studies and we said, no, up to 20% blending, there's minimal wear and tear or corrosion in in some of the parts of the car. In any case, we were right. Now you can get inexpensive kits available in case you need to make the adjustment on some of the rubber parts or whatever. The good news is that 20% was only in our minds, because it's also partly conditioned by the fact we were not sure that we'd get the feed. Because you cannot base the entire program on sugar or molasses or whatever. So we diversified the feed, and which is understandable. I'm very happy to tell you today we are in the happy situation of having crossed, I think, 15.9 or 16% last month. We are going to cross 20% well before the target date. And we are already, and I don't mind saying this because I see press reports. In any case, whatever I say is bound to be nuanced when my friends here, distinguished members of the Fourth Estate, report this. Everybody's already talking about a post-2025 roadmap on biofuels. And I think that's the shape. I was in Brazil after being in DC and Houston. And the Brazilians, I think, have a blending of about 27%, and they were telling me that they're taking it up to 34%. Now, this is continuing even as more and more and more oil is becoming available in the global market. I think it's a self-evident proposition that there is no shortage of crude in the world today. Whatever you see in terms of price, that is essentially determined by the amount of crude oil that is released for trading. Prior to this current phase, the total amount of crude which was extracted per day was, I think, 102 million barrels a day. Then OPEC Plus cut back the production by about 5 million barrels or so. You had another large entity which was producing 13 million barrels a day. They cut back a little bit because of other factors and price caps on their oil, etc. The United States, I think, produces also 13 million barrels a day. I'm not a political soothsayer or a forecaster, but the message I saw in Houston, talking to all my colleagues who are the, by the way, you described me as the petroleum and natural gas minister. I'm much happier when they describe me as the minister for energy transition, but that's a call the government has to take. But because today you have more than enough oil coming on the market, even from traditional suppliers. The Brazilians, I mentioned them only in passing because they produce about 3.4 million barrels a day. When I was in Brazil, I heard that they're getting another 300, 400,000 barrels per day, which is going to be additionally available. Then there are Guyana, there is Suriname, and all the others. And you know, in our own E&P, that is our exploration production, we've got several Guyanas waiting to be discovered offshore here. So even whilst we are concentrating on the E&P offshore, and I want to just share with you some of the responses to the bidding. I know I was having fun with some of my colleagues. I said, you guys said that the response to the OALP, which is the open acreage licensing policy, was tepid. It wasn't. It was actually a very good turnout. So I'll just repeat those figures in a minute. We are witnessing today, I think, on account of a number of factors, and I say this because I'm not the original thinker on this, but whenever there is turbulence, whenever there are other issues, a transition takes place faster. When oil prices go up beyond what are regarded as reasonable limits, again transition takes place faster. Let me give you a little snapshot picture of where we are in terms of consumption. 70% of our vehicular traffic on the roads today is, I think, of two-wheelers and three-wheelers. And a lot of it, I used the word yesterday, much of it, and I was corrected by one of my young friends. He said a lot of it is people plying those two-wheelers, three-wheelers on the basis of battery swap. You know, you have a two-wheeler or three-wheeler, you go up to a station, you immediately change your battery, put it in, take another one out. It takes less than 10 minutes, and they adjust whatever is remaining of that onto your cost. The rollout of electric vehicles in the Indian market, again, if you look at some other figures, they're not as impressive, but they're very impressive. If you look at the new rollouts, and by the way, these are electric vehicles made in India, not build your dream made in China. Today, the rollout of CNG E20, we had given a commitment that by April of, I think it was this year or last year, Rasal, E20 would be rolled out in April this year. We not only did that, but we have E100, that is 100% ethanol, available in 400 dispensing stations. Why are we doing it? Because otherwise you're in the chicken and egg story. The guy who drives a tractor based on diesel wants to switch, but there's not enough ethanol available. Now, and the ethanol guys tell me, we put it in 400 stations and 4 stations. I said, no, give it a little gap. Now the guy has an incentive. And now we have to also ensure that there is enough ethanol, which I'm confident. In fact, now I have to ensure that the ethanol, people are now beginning to, it's a win-win for people in the ecosystem, people in agriculture, but then people get a little greedy, they want to raise the prices, etc., which has happened, the market takes place. So basically, a sensible government policy, technology, and the marketplace. That is what will determine ultimately what the fuel mix would be. On gas, I just want to spend a minute. We took a decision some time ago that the natural gas in our energy mix would go up from 6% to 15%. Now, I happen to get associated with this ministry during the pandemic, when the pandemic was in full blown. So I used to get nervous. I said, how are we going to take it, when the economic activity was down, but I can tell you with confidence now, 3 years after I've joined, that 15% figure in the gas in our energy mix 15 is no longer unrealistic. I think we're already 8 plus, we're already looking at scenarios of 11, 12%, and therefore natural gas will come up. One area where I am particularly gratified is making clean cooking gas available to our households. Now, any discussion on energy with FT or ExxonMobil or Chevron or anybody else, we have the same problem. We seem to forget that there are large parts of the country, of the world, where they don't have any access to clean energy. Now, in our case, we have a scheme called Ujjwala, but I'll come to that in a minute. In 2014, when Mr. Modi took over, we had 140 million connections, which means households with LPG gas. Today, that has been raised to 330 million. So if you take the average that each household has 4 or 5 people, we virtually cover the whole population. But this is LPG, which comes as a product from a refinery. But if you take a natural gas, we had 14,000 line kilometers of pipeline in 2014. We now have 22,500 line kilometers, which is going to go up to 3,000 kilometers, I think, by 2030. And once that comes, we are supplying actually clean natural gas at 25-30% less cost. So the Ujjwala scheme came in 2016. We were able to give 100 million connections on that, mostly in the rural areas. Today, a beneficiary of the Ujjwala scheme is able to get cooking gas for the family for as little as 5 cents in a day. And those who are not beneficiaries of the scheme get it for 15 or 16 cents in a day. That's a very major achievement in terms of, the energy transition is concerned. Otherwise, you're going to use firewood, charcoal, and, all that is done. And one of our entrepreneurs, smart guy, he sold 1 million cooktops to a country in Africa because they didn't have any access to LPG. So, and he imported 93 octane ethanol from Brazil, and he's running a flourishing business. Now we have a global biofuels alliance, and I see the clock reminding me about the time. I'll spend a minute or two, then we'll have an interaction. It's better. On green hydrogen, I have been absolutely clear, and that's a firm belief, that the fuel of the future is green hydrogen. All the biofuels will help, everything will help. But the major transition will take place when we are able to crack the green hydrogen equation. When I just joined, Jennifer Greenhalgh, the American US Secretary of Energy, told me 1 for 1 for 1, which means 1 kilo of green hydrogen for $1 in 10 years. A lot of people come and try to sell me a line saying we've reduced the cost of green hydrogen to $2.5. I don't buy it. I think if you talk to the professionals, they'll tell you the cost of green hydrogen per kilo is still around $5 plus, and that's been done in a few places. But my submission to you is green hydrogen will succeed in a country like India. Why? It will succeed only where there is local demand, local production, and local consumption, because the gas does not lend itself to transportation. Therefore, green hydrogen is a success story unfolding in India. We have every possible manufacturer of electrolyzers in the world setting up shop here. It's without any doubt that many people in the world, including in the United States, want to see India develop as a major hub and manufacturer of electrolyzers. What do you need to make green hydrogen? You need to bring the cost of clean solar energy down, which we have demonstrated. We brought it down from 25 cents to 3 cents a unit. And you need electrolyzers. I think we are on the path of doing that. We have some fascinating work going on. I keep joking with my previous colleague, who was the Minister for Power, I said, electricity only consumes 17% of our energy. The rest of it comes from, the green hydrogen will succeed when our refineries take it over. The IOCL has 11, they've already got 2 on it. The previous chairman had promised me another 2. Whenever the next guy takes over, I'm going to be chasing him to make sure, but that energy transition is taking place. If you look at the developments being done on pump storage and other areas, I think green hydrogen is there. Now, I've told you a little bit about biofuels, a little bit about gas, a little bit about green hydrogen. I come back. No matter which survey I look at, which global outlook I look at, they still have the entire energy basket anchored in traditional energy, crude oil based for quite some time to come. I don't buy their system, but they take it right up to 2050. I think that's not going to happen. It will happen much quicker because 2 things will happen. If you bring the cost of green hydrogen down, which I think will come because of the research and innovative work I'm seeing, including by some fantastic energy startups here, we are spending currently about $150 billion on imports of traditional energy. We buy $20 billion from the United States, just to give you an example. Now, the minute the price comes down to say, let's say $2.50, and you have $150 billion of import bill, the pressure will build from our activists and everywhere. It's instead of spending $150 billion and enlarging the toxicity, enhancing the toxicity, shift to green hydrogen, and they'll come on scale. So I see that happening. I'm going to stick my neck out and anticipate a question by when. I think the crucial test will come in 2030, around then. Because now all the electrolyzer manufacturing is taking place, people are shifting in India, they're looking at green hydrogen for steel, for shipbuilding, for railways, etc. But once we have an idea as to where the electrolyzer, I had a very young, bright young startup backed by a unicorn, backed by a global venture fund, and he's very much into the manufacture of electrolyzers without membranes. So there are a lot of fascinating things happening, but we will still need to be anchored. I don't buy the outlook of 2050. I think, but today we are in 2024, I would say at least another 20 years or so. And when the marketplace backed by technology produces change, you will get the change. I'm going to stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister. I wonder if before we go to questions, I wonder if I can just clarify, are you suggesting that India's
point, this is my view, of already, demand will go up, but the other green energy sources are coming up quite fast. But when will it peak? 2040? I don't know. I think what will happen is a shift from import dependence, which is very high for crude oil just now. I think about 85, 88%. That will shift. Then there will be a public pressure on the policymakers to incentivize scale on green hydrogen production.
Okay. My colleague John has some questions. John Reid, the FT South Asia Bureau Chief.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Fascinating comments. You said several Guyanas are waiting to be discovered offshore India. I love that comment. Why hasn't this happened already, though? And is there a way that the E&P process might become more investor-friendly in India to make this happen? And to be clear, I'm not talking just about foreign investors.
No, that's a brilliant
level
question.
Playing field.
It's a brilliant question, and I'm sure my written presentation must have had it. It's very simple. We just took the eye off the ball. There was neglect, and I would go to the extent of saying that neglect borders on criminal neglect. We have about 3.5 million square kilometers of sedimentary basin. I'm not going to go into the previous government didn't. I'm not going to do that. What Mr. Modi has done is, out of this, he has cleared 1 million square kilometers, which was earlier no-go area. By no-go area, I mean either the Navy had a problem there, or the Coast Guard had a problem, or the DRDO had a problem. Everybody said, we can't, this is not allowed. So we said, nothing doing. We had internal discussion, we cleared that 1 million square feet. These bids which have come for OALP 9 round, and the 10th one is coming, 38% of those bids are in that no-go area. Now what happens is, I mean, I'm not a geologist, I'm very new to the sector. If you have a major oil find in that same ocean there are several Guyanas to be made. I mean, what happened in Guyana also? I mean, it's folklore. Or in some of the other places, they dug 16 times. I'm not going to any one particular because otherwise I'll be called for commercial, 16 times, nothing. 17 times they struck it. Struck oil and boom, it's up.
But these, sorry,
No, can I complete this? Can I complete
yeah,
now?
please do.
So it's one is clearing no-go areas. Secondly, you refer to something as not being particularly investor friendly. I would agree with you. There is a mindset and attitude change in all this. Let me explain to you why. Earlier, what would happen is, look, there are only about 4 or 5 majors in the world who get involved with this. And I said, I was with Exxon yesterday, I was with British Petroleum a few days earlier, I've had meetings with Chevron, I have a meeting today also, I think, yeah. What would they do? They would come and they would help, they spend a lot of money, and then we would invoke sovereign right. It's very different now. I went to Brazil and in a discussion with Petrobras, and Petrobras is uniquely positioned to, because they have very good experience on deep water, offshore. So I said, you come, join Oil India Limited, they're prospecting off the Andaman waters, and you don't have to make any investment. I say the same thing to all the other oil mills. Don't make any investment, just come in. We will incentivize that. We will provide the resources for that. And if you strike oil, and if you're a partner, you'll have the right of refusal, which means they will act on it. Another thing I wanted to mention to you, and I'm sorry I interrupted you, because this is the part of the conversation which is most important. We sat down with the majors and said, look guys, tell us which are the areas where you want tweaking in policy. Because we have an old 1948 Mines and Oilfield Regulation Act. So what they did was they gave us points. I went to the cabinet with a note, got the cabinet approval, and I filed in the parliament. In the next session, which will be hopefully next month, it will be next month, I will get that bill passed and it will be enacted into law. So all those residuals, so we've cleared up no-go areas, we put all the data which people require onto a national repository in the University of Texas in Houston. Plus you have these changes in law. These together, I think, provide the new attractiveness, and that is what I think explains the interest of the oil majors in this soil. Plus, I mean, if you look at around the world, I don't see consumption in Europe going up. I mean, for whatever reason, they're satiated. We won't go into the details of what's happening on nuclear or gas, Russia, not a. If you look at Latin America, the Caribbean, you look at Africa, India, China also, large economy, even if it goes small, in 2%, 3%, it's a lot of economic opportunity. But India is where the real growth, at least I said, according to someone, 25% in the next 2 days, is going to come. So partnering India has also an underlying, I think, advantage. So that is what I think explains their interest. Of course, nothing is done, it still is done, and the 10th round will come after the legislation passes Parliament. We were deliberately timing it so that the 9th round will complete. We have 68 bids for 28 blocks, 2.4.
So this will get passed in the winter session?
Yeah, it will. Okay. Because I only submitted because there was a lot of legislation which came in. So it was a question of time in the last session.
Okay, and one final question from me. Have the no-go areas been heavily explored? Presumably not, right?
They are in the, it was only done I think a year ago, that decision. And in this one, 38% of the bids are actually in the no-go areas, and the remaining will come in the 10th round.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think we've got time for one more question. gentleman there in the white shirt in the middle table.
Please identify yourself also. Sir.
So by which year we can expect a carbon credit
Sorry, would you mind
facility to be
identifying
rolled out
yourself?
by Indian government for industries in India?
Sorry, would you mind just stating your name and affiliation?
My question is, by which year carbon credit tax benefits to be rolled out in India?
Yeah,
for industries?
I wish I had the turf clearance to answer that, because I have very good views on it. I'm not the minister concerned. I should not be answering it in a thing like this. I'm hoping sooner than later.
Okay, because in rest of the other world areas, it's already coping
No,
up.
there was a fascinating discussion on this yesterday in ExxonMobil session, where somebody said, why are you using CCS and not CCUS? So, all right, but I don't think it's fair for me to answer that question.
Okay, sir.
Because it's very easy for me to freelance on what should happen. I'm not the responsible minister for that.
Right, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wonder if I can just sneak in one more question. I just wanted to clarify, when you say that it's going to be easier essentially to explore for and exploit these reserves, these several Guyanas worth of reserves off the coast, and then when you say that when India is looking at increased refining capacity, it's mostly going to be for petrochemicals, you think? It's not?
No. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. You see, we have today 252 million metric tons per annum refining capacity. We have that. Okay? We are today not just a importer of crude oil. We import crude oil, we process it and sell the refined products outside. In fact, if you look at the Indian import-export basket, petrol products. I mean, give you an example of Brazil. We buy crude from them and we sell diesel back to them. So that refining capacity is very much part of this. But the question arises, we are going to be at 300 because of these all refineries which are already in the pipeline. But the question arises, where do you want to go? Do you want to go to 400 or you want to go to 450? I have been using the word 400. I've been using the figure 400. I heard the Prime Minister in, I think, one of the IEWs, in Goa IEW, he used the figure 450. So when we started looking at it, where is this going to be utilized? First of all, what will be the global scenario? I personally think that refineries which are very small are no longer going to be viable. I see we are already the fourth largest refiner in the world. I see in times to come, India will be one of the few regional refining hubs. When that happens, you will be refining your own oil, the more that you get. My import dependence, madam, is 88% just now. So this E&P is designed to, because look, at the end of the day, it's a race. If it remains there unexploited, when the transition comes total, there's a philosophical debate on that. So we would like to utilize our own resources. I keep telling Guyana, I said, you've got a big find, but by the time this oil starts coming into the market, the transition already would be in a pretty advanced stage. So, and a lot of people don't want to release more than, or even their quotas, thinking that will keep the price up. The market is not following that. The market is on its own trip, if I may be allowed to use that term. Because the market sees what is happening. And balancing budgets is no longer a consideration in an energy discussion. Because if there are new people coming on the global market, they will sell their oil. So it's a complicated situation in that we have to make sure that criminal neglect on E&P is rectified, which we have succeeded in doing. I will start, but the gestation period is very long. Plus, we're stepping on the green hydrogen transition and the biofuels transition. I'm not, again, into what will it be, but as I see, the Brazilians have gone from 27 to 35% biofuel blending, and the Brazilians have the resources. They've got 3 times our land area, 1/6 our population. They could, if they want, and now we have a global biofuels alliance, which, by the way, we approved the headquarters agreement to be situated here. But it's a multi-stakeholder. It's not just countries, but the industries which are part of it. So I see a big push coming on biofuels, but I think I reserve my optimism finally for green hydrogen.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm sure we could spend pretty much the entire afternoon listening to more of this, but we are incredibly grateful that you've been able to spend as much time with us as you have, Minister Puri. Please join me in thanking the Minister for
Thank you very much.